Psychological influence techniques represent powerful, evidence-based methods for shaping human behavior and decision-making in predictable ways. Unlike the sensationalized mind control tactics often portrayed in popular media, genuine psychological influence principles are grounded in decades of scientific research in social psychology, cognitive science, and behavioral economics. These approaches leverage our understanding of how the human mind processes information, forms judgments, and makes decisions. While these techniques can significantly enhance your ability to persuade and connect with others, their power demands ethical consideration. The capacity to influence others carries substantial responsibility. These methods should never be employed to manipulate, deceive, or harm. Instead, ethical application focuses on creating mutual benefit, helping others make decisions that serve their interests while also achieving your legitimate objectives. The distinction between influence and manipulation lies primarily in intention and outcome. Ethical influence creates value for all parties, while manipulation extracts value primarily for the influencer. Responsible application requires transparency, respect for autonomy, and a commitment to creating genuine value. The most effective practitioners understand that sustainable influence comes from building trust and providing real benefits, not from short-term manipulation that ultimately damages relationships. By maintaining ethical boundaries and focusing on positive applications, these techniques can dramatically enhance your ability to communicate effectively, build meaningful connections, and achieve positive outcomes across personal and professional contexts. As we explore these evidence-based approaches, remember that the most powerful influence comes not from psychological tricks, but from combining these principles with genuine value creation and authentic connection. The name recognition technique represents one of the simplest yet most powerful psychological tools available. Research consistently shows that hearing one's own name activates unique brain regions, specifically the middle frontal cortex, middle and superior temporal cortex, and cuneus, areas associated with self-recognition and attention. This neurological response explains why we can often detect someone saying our name even in a noisy, crowded environment, a phenomenon psychologists call the cocktail party effect. When you deliberately use someone's name during conversation, you create an immediate personal connection. This small act signals recognition of individual identity. You're addressing them specifically, not just anyone in the room. Studies have demonstrated that hearing one's name produces a measurable dopamine release, creating positive associations with both the speaker and the interaction itself. This neurochemical response helps explain why name recognition feels inherently rewarding and attention-focusing. The technique shows maximum effectiveness when used naturally at strategic moments, at the beginning of an interaction to establish connection, when making important points to ensure attention, and at the conclusion to reinforce the personal nature of the exchange. However, balance remains critical. Overuse can seem manipulative or forced. The key is authentic integration that acknowledges the individual without seeming mechanical or sales-oriented. In professional settings, combining someone's name with specific recognition of their contributions creates particularly powerful engagement. Rather than generic acknowledgement, saying, "Sarah, your analysis of the market trends really helped shape our strategy," creates a memorable moment of connection while reinforcing valued behaviors. As we transition to exploring active listening methods, we'll see how this initial connection through name recognition creates the foundation for deeper understanding through attentive, reflective conversation. Active listening transforms ordinary conversations into meaningful exchanges where participants feel genuinely understood. At its core, reflective listening involves paraphrasing what someone has expressed, demonstrating that you've not only heard their words, but comprehended their underlying meaning and emotional state. This technique, pioneered by psychologist Carl Rogers, creates what neuroscientists call neural resonance, a state where brain activation patterns between speakers and listeners actually synchronize, creating biological alignment that enhances connection. The validation component is equally important. By acknowledging the legitimacy of someone's feelings without judgment, You create psychological safety that encourages further openness. Research shows that when someone accurately reflects our thoughts back to us, our brain's reward centers activate in patterns similar to those observed when receiving physical rewards. This neurological response explains why feeling understood is inherently satisfying and connection-building. Effective reflective listening follows a specific pattern. Attentive silence without interruption, followed by paraphrasing using phrases like, "it sounds like," or "what I'm hearing is." Then check for accuracy with questions like, "did I understand that correctly?" This process demonstrates respect for the speaker's perspective, even when you might ultimately disagree with their conclusions. Studies by relationship psychologist John Gottman found that couples who practiced reflective listening during conflicts were significantly more likely to reach constructive resolutions. As we move toward exploring positive reinforcement, we can see how active listening creates the attentional foundation necessary for effective reinforcement. By demonstrating that you're genuinely present and understanding someone's perspective, you establish the credibility needed for your subsequent recognition to feel authentic and meaningful, creating a natural progression in relationship development. Positive reinforcement stands as one of behavioral psychology's most thoroughly validated principles. First documented through B.F. Skinner's pioneering research, this approach demonstrates that behaviors followed by rewarding consequences tend to be repeated, while those without reinforcement diminish over time. The effectiveness of positive reinforcement hinges on several key factors: immediacy, specificity, and authenticity. The timing of reinforcement is crucial. Neurological studies show that the shorter the interval between a behavior and its reinforcement, the stronger the neural connection formed. When you immediately acknowledge someone's contribution with, "Thanks for jumping in on that report, Alex, it really made a difference," you're creating a direct association between their helpful behavior and the positive feeling of recognition. This temporal proximity maximizes the reinforcement effect through what neuroscientists call spike timing-dependent plasticity, the brain's mechanism for strengthening neural connections. Specificity transforms generic praise into powerful motivation. Research on workplace motivation consistently shows that specific recognition, your detailed analysis of the customer feedback helped us identify the core issue, creates significantly stronger reinforcement than general comments. "Good job." This specificity demonstrates genuine attention to the person's actions, clarifies exactly which behaviors are valued, and provides a clear template for future performance. As we transition to examining mirroring techniques, we see how positive reinforcement creates the motivational foundation for deeper connection. While reinforcement builds value around specific behaviors, mirroring creates subconscious alignment that enhances overall rapport, addressing complementary aspects of relationship development through both conscious appreciation and unconscious synchronization. Mirroring, the subtle matching of another person's body language, speech patterns, and expressions, operates through neurological mechanisms that create powerful unconscious connections. This technique works through the activation of mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action. This neurological system creates an automatic sense of similarity and connection that operates largely below conscious awareness. Research by body language expert Dr. David Lewis found that effective mirroring should remain subtle enough to avoid conscious detection. When someone notices deliberate mirroring, the effect reverses, creating discomfort rather than connection. The most effective approach involves a slight delay, 2 to 3 seconds, before adopting similar postures or gestures, and mirroring should be partial rather than exact, matching the general energy and openness of someone's posture rather than precisely copying every movement. Several forms of mirroring create connection: postural mirroring, similar body positions; gestural mirroring, comparable hand movements; vocal mirroring, matching speech rate and tone; and emotional mirroring, reflecting similar energy levels. Studies indicate that different mirroring approaches are appropriate for different relationship contexts. In negotiations, for instance, postural mirroring has been found more effective than vocal mirroring. Beyond building rapport, skilled mirroring can also guide interactions. Research by communication expert Dr. Lillian Glass shows that gradually shifting your own body language after establishing mirroring can subtly influence the other person to follow your lead. This creates opportunities to calm tense situations by slowly adopting more relaxed postures, or to energize low engagement interactions by gradually introducing more animated expressions after establishing initial connection through mirroring. The strategic pause, a deliberate silence during conversation, stands as one of the most underutilized yet powerful conversational tools available. In a world characterized by rapid exchanges and constant communication, the intentional use of silence creates a distinctive psychological impact that can transform interaction dynamics. This technique leverages our inherent discomfort with conversational gaps to create productive tension. Research in conversational analysis reveals that most people can tolerate only about 4 seconds of silence before feeling compelled to speak. This natural aversion to conversational gaps creates a powerful opportunity for those who can strategically manage silence. When you introduce a deliberate pause after making a point or asking a question, you create what psychologists call constructive tension, a psychological state that often leads others to elaborate, clarify, or provide additional information beyond what they might have initially offered. Harvard negotiation expert Francesca Gino's research demonstrates that strategic pauses are particularly effective during high-stakes discussions. Her studies reveal that negotiators who incorporated deliberate pauses of 5 to 7 seconds after making offers achieve settlements approximately 15% more favorable than those who continued speaking. The pause creates space for the other party to fully process the information presented and often leads them to reveal their thinking or offer concessions to break the tension-filled silence. The most powerful moments to pause include immediately after asking an important question, after making a key point or request, when receiving pushback or objections, and after hearing potentially sensitive information. As we transition to exploring pacing and leading methods, we'll see how strategic pauses create the space necessary for effectively adopting and gradually shifting conversational patterns to guide interactions in productive directions. The pacing and leading method represents a sophisticated approach to guiding conversations toward productive outcomes while maintaining genuine connection. Developed initially in therapeutic contexts by psychologist Richard Bandler and linguist John Grinder, this technique has since been validated through extensive research in communication psychology and applied successfully across numerous professional fields. The foundational principle of pacing involves temporarily adopting aspects of another person's communication style, their speaking tempo, energy level, vocabulary choices, and conceptual frameworks. This creates what psychologists call communicative alignment, a state where both parties feel unconsciously understood due to similarities in expression patterns. Neurological research reveals that this alignment activates mirror neuron systems in the brain, creating a neurobiological basis for rapport and receptivity. The critical transition from pacing to leading represents the technique's true sophistication. After establishing synchronization through pacing, you can gradually shift your communication patterns, speaking slightly faster or slower, introducing new concepts, or suggesting alternative perspectives. Research shows that when preceded by effective pacing, these shifts are often unconsciously followed by your conversation partner. This creates an opportunity to guide interactions toward more productive territory without triggering resistance. Implementation requires attentiveness and flexibility. Effective pacing begins with careful observation, noting not just what someone says, but how they express themselves. The transition to leading should occur only after establishing clear rapport, typically 3 to 5 minutes into an interaction. As we move toward understanding emotional labeling, we'll discover how explicitly acknowledging emotions can further enhance connection and create psychological safety during potentially challenging conversations. Emotional labeling, the practice of explicitly identifying emotions in conversation, represents a breakthrough technique in effective communication, particularly during high-stakes or emotionally charged interactions. Pioneered by FBI negotiator Chris Voss and extensively researched by psychologists, this approach transforms the traditional avoidance of emotional dynamics into a powerful tool for creating understanding and resolving tensions. The scientific foundation of emotional labeling lies in our neurological response to emotions. Research at UCLA's Department of Psychology demonstrates that putting feelings into words, a process called affect labeling, activates the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex while reducing activity in the amygdala, our brain's emotional alarm system. This neurological shift literally calms the emotional brain, creating space for more rational processing. When you accurately label someone's emotion with phrases like, "You seem frustrated right now," or "It sounds like this situation is causing you concern," you're helping engage their brain's regulatory systems. The technique's implementation follows a distinct pattern for maximum effectiveness. First, observe emotional cues. Tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, and word choice all provide insights into underlying feelings. Next, formulate a tentative label using phrases like "it seems like" or "I'm sensing that," rather than definitive statements. This approach acknowledges emotions without presuming complete understanding. Finally, pause after offering the label, creating space for confirmation, correction, or elaboration. As we transition to exploring persuasion strategies in Section 3, we'll see how these conversation tactics create the foundation for effective influence. By establishing connection through strategic pauses, pacing and leading, and emotional labeling, you create the psychological safety and rapport necessary for ethical persuasion approaches that respect autonomy while guiding toward mutual benefit. Anchoring represents one of the most powerful and consistently demonstrated principles in the psychology of influence. This cognitive bias, first documented by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, describes how individuals rely heavily on the first piece of information encountered, the anchor, when making decisions. In negotiation and persuasion contexts, understanding and strategically applying anchoring can dramatically shape outcomes. The cognitive mechanism behind anchoring operates through what neuroscientists call selective activation. When an initial value or position is introduced, it activates compatible information in the brain while suppressing contradictory information. Neuroimaging studies reveal that once an anchor is established, the brain actually works to justify and support that reference point rather than evaluating it objectively. This creates a powerful cognitive gravitational pull toward whatever value is presented first. In negotiation contexts, anchoring manifests through first offers that establish the range of potential outcomes. Research by negotiation expert Adam Galinsky demonstrated that final settlements typically end up closer to the first offer than the first counteroffer, regardless of the offer's reasonableness. His study showed that even seasoned negotiators who were explicitly warned about anchoring effects still showed significant influence from initial offers, highlighting the technique's robustness. The strategic implementation of anchoring requires preparation and psychological insight. Effective anchors should be ambitious yet justifiable. Research indicates that anchors seen as completely arbitrary or unrealistic can trigger reactance and backfire. As we explore the door-in-the-face technique next, we'll see how anchoring principles can be extended through strategic sequencing of requests to increase compliance through contrast effects. The door-in-the-face technique represents a fascinating paradox in persuasive communication. Starting with rejection actually increases your chances of eventual success. This counterintuitive approach, scientifically validated through decades of social psychology research, leverages our deeply ingrained social norms about reciprocity and fairness to create powerful compliance effects. The technique's name vividly captures its psychological mechanism. Just as having a door slammed in your face initially seems like failure, the first large request is designed to be refused. However, this initial rejection sets the stage for success with the subsequent smaller request. The pioneering research on this approach by Robert Cialdini and his colleagues demonstrated remarkably consistent results. Presenting an extreme request followed by a more moderate one increased compliance rates by an average of 36% compared to presenting only the moderate request alone. The psychological foundations of this technique operate through several mechanisms. First, the contrast principle ensures that after considering an extreme request, the follow-up request appears significantly more reasonable by comparison. Second, social reciprocity norms create subtle pressure. When someone makes a concession by reducing their request, we feel obligated to reciprocate this concession by being more compliant. Finally, self-presentation concerns motivate us to appear reasonable and consistent after declining the initial request. Timing emerges as a critical factor in successful implementation. Research shows that the second request must follow within minutes of the first to maintain the psychological connection between them. As we transition to examining the foot-in-the-door method, we'll see how these seemingly opposite approaches, starting large versus starting small, leverage different psychological principles to achieve compliance through complementary pathways. The foot-in-the-door method stands as one of social psychology's most thoroughly validated influence techniques. First documented by researchers Friedman and Fraser in 1966, this approach has consistently demonstrated remarkable effectiveness across cultures and contexts. The method's essence lies in its sequential approach to gaining compliance, starting with a small, easily accepted request before gradually advancing to larger ones. The psychological mechanism driving this technique involves our deep-seated desire for self-consistency. When someone agrees to an initial small request, they unconsciously begin to form a self-perception as someone who supports that type of action or cause. This self-perception creates internal pressure to maintain consistency with subsequent related requests. Neurological research reveals that this consistency motivation activates the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors contradictions between our actions and self-image. Experimental validation of this technique shows impressive results. In the original Friedman and Fraser studies, participants who first agreed to a tiny request, placing a small sign in their window, were 400% more likely to accept a much larger request later, installing a large, unsightly billboard in their yard, compared to those approached directly with the larger request. This dramatic difference highlights how seemingly inconsequential initial compliance can significantly reshape receptiveness to major requests. The effectiveness of foot-in-the-door relies on several key implementation factors. First, the initial request must be small enough to virtually ensure compliance, ideally something that over 80% of people would agree to without hesitation. Second, the person should perform the small action rather than simply agreeing to it. Active compliance strengthens the self-perception effect. As we move to exploring social proof, we'll see how individual consistency tendencies can be complemented by collective influence mechanisms. Social proof represents perhaps humanity's oldest and most pervasive influence mechanism. This principle, formalized by psychologist Robert Cialdini but observed throughout human history, describes our tendency to look to others' actions to determine appropriate behavior, especially in ambiguous situations. The power of social proof lies in its evolutionary origins. For our ancestors, following the group often meant the difference between survival and disaster. The neurological basis for social proof has been well documented through contemporary research. fMRI studies reveal that when we observe others' choices activating reward centers in our brains, we experience similar activation when making the same choice ourselves. This neural mirroring explains why social influence feels natural rather than coercive. Our brains literally reward us for conforming to observed social norms. The strength of social proof varies significantly depending on several key factors. First, similarity matters tremendously. We're most influenced by the actions of people we perceive as similar to ourselves in relevant ways. Research demonstrates that seeing choices made by demographically similar others increases compliance by up to 300% compared to seeing the same choices made by dissimilar others. Second, the number of people matters, but with diminishing returns. Seeing 5 people take an action creates strong social proof, while the difference between 50 and 500 people is negligible. The strategic application of social proof takes various forms. Testimonials from relevant peers, usage statistics, 93% of customers recommend, demonstration of popularity, best-selling, and showing real-time adoption. 12 people are viewing this right now. All leverage this principle. As we conclude this section on persuasion strategies, we see how these techniques, anchoring, door in the face, foot in the door, and social proof, provide complementary approaches to ethical influence that respect psychological realities while guiding toward positive outcomes. The reciprocity norm stands as one of humanity's most universal social principles, transcending cultural boundaries and shaping interactions across every human society studied. Anthropologists have documented this principle operating in tribal cultures completely isolated from modern influence, suggesting its deeply rooted evolutionary origins. At its core, reciprocity represents the social expectation that people should return favors, gifts, and gestures in kind, creating a foundation for cooperative social systems. The evolutionary advantage of reciprocity explains its universal nature. Early human groups that developed strong reciprocity norms could better share resources, distribute risk, and cooperate on large-scale projects impossible for individuals. Neurological research reveals that reciprocity operates through both reward and punishment pathways in the brain. We experience positive neurochemical responses when reciprocating kindness and uncomfortable stress responses when failing to reciprocate. Strategic application of reciprocity begins with genuine, uninvited giving. Studies show that unexpected small gifts, useful information freely shared, or helpful actions without explicit request create the strongest reciprocity effects. The timing between giving and receiving significantly impacts effectiveness. Allowing a brief period between your gesture and subsequent request creates stronger compliance than immediate requests, which can appear explicitly manipulative. The size of the initial gesture follows a specific pattern of effectiveness. Interestingly, research indicates that modest, thoughtful gestures often produce stronger reciprocity than extravagant ones, which can create uncomfortable levels of indebtedness or suspicion about motives. The key factor appears to be perceived thoughtfulness and personalization rather than objective value. As we transition to examining the Zeigarnik effect, we'll see how different psychological principles target distinct aspects of human cognition and motivation. The Zeigarnik effect, named after Lithuanian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who first documented the phenomenon in 1927, describes our mind's tendency to remember uncompleted tasks better than completed ones. Her original observation occurred in a cafe, where she noticed that waiters could recall complex, unfinished orders with remarkable accuracy, but quickly forgot details once the orders were completed. This cognitive tendency has profound implications for attention, memory, and influence strategies. The neuropsychological basis for this effect lies in the tension state created by unfinished tasks. When we begin an activity but don't complete it, our brain maintains an active neural representation, essentially keeping the task open in working memory. This creates a subtle but persistent cognitive tension that continues until resolution occurs. Neuroimaging studies show that uncompleted tasks maintain activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal regions associated with goal maintenance, while completed tasks show rapid deactivation in these same areas. The strategic application of the Zeigarnik effect in communication involves deliberately creating open loops that maintain psychological engagement. By introducing intriguing information but withholding resolution, you create cognitive tension that keeps the other person mentally engaged with your message. Research demonstrates that presenting partial information followed by the phrase, "But I'll tell you more about that later," significantly improves recall of the information compared to providing complete details immediately. In persuasive communication, the Zeigarnik effect can be deployed through a specific sequence. First, raise an intriguing question or present a partial insight that creates cognitive tension. Next, temporarily shift to related information that builds context. Finally, return to resolve the open loop with your key message. As we explore the power of because, next, we'll see how our fundamental need for causal understanding complements the tension resolution pattern of the Zeigarnik effect. The power of because represents one of the most elegantly demonstrated principles in persuasion research. Harvard psychologist Ellen Langer's classic study revealed this effect through a simple experiment. When asking to cut in line at a copy machine, requests including the word because followed by any reason, even a meaningless one, increased compliance from 60% to 93%. This dramatic difference highlights our deep psychological need for explanations and causal understanding. The neurological foundation for this effect involves our brain's inherent drive for pattern recognition and causal understanding. From an evolutionary perspective, identifying cause and effect relationships provided survival advantages. Understanding why events occur helps predict and control future outcomes. Neuroimaging studies show that when we receive explanations, even simple ones, the brain's reward centers activate, releasing dopamine that creates positive associations with the explained information or request. The linguistic trigger, because, appears uniquely powerful across languages, with equivalent terms showing similar effects in different cultures. This word serves as a cognitive marker that signals an explanation follows, priming the brain to process the information as a reason rather than merely additional information. Research demonstrates that alternative phrases like the reason is or due to produce similar but slightly weaker effects, suggesting that because has developed specialized psychological impact through cultural learning. The quality of reasons following because reveals interesting patterns. Counterintuitively, studies show that beyond a minimal threshold of relevance, the strength of the reason matters less than its mere presence. This suggests that the psychological need being fulfilled is primarily procedural. We want to know that there's a reason, even if the reason itself isn't particularly compelling. As we transition to examining the halo effect, we'll explore how initial impressions in one area can create powerful spillover effects across seemingly unrelated domains. The halo effect represents one of the most pervasive cognitive biases influencing perception and judgment across virtually all human interactions. First documented by psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920, this psychological tendency causes positive impressions in one area to spill over and positively influence perceptions in unrelated areas. The effect creates a coherent but often inaccurate positive or negative gestalt that colors overall evaluation. The cognitive mechanism behind this effect involves what psychologists call associative coherence, our brain's natural tendency to seek consistent patterns rather than maintaining disconnected evaluations. This cognitive efficiency helps us navigate complex social environments but creates systematic biases. Neurologically, when we form a positive impression in one domain, it primes neural networks to more readily activate positive associations in other domains, creating a self-reinforcing evaluative loop that shapes subsequent perceptions. Research demonstrates the halo effect's remarkable scope. Physically attractive people are consistently rated as more intelligent, competent, and moral than average-looking counterparts despite identical behavior. Products from companies with strong reputations in one category receive higher quality ratings in unrelated categories. Even professionals like doctors and teachers who display warmth are rated as more technically competent than equally skilled but less warm colleagues. The strategic implication of this research is clear. First impressions on visible, immediately apparent attributes disproportionately influence overall evaluations. Studies show that impressions form with remarkable speed. Research indicates that judgments made after just 100 milliseconds of exposure correlate strongly with evaluations made after much longer periods. As we move into Section 5's exploration of decision-making influences, we'll see how these fundamental psychological principles interact with specific contextual factors to shape choices in predictable ways. The scarcity principle stands as one of the most powerful psychological triggers in human decision-making. This fundamental principle, extensively documented by psychologist Robert Cialdini, establishes that humans place significantly higher value on items or opportunities that are limited in quantity or restricted in availability. The psychological impact of scarcity operates through multiple cognitive and emotional pathways, creating a compelling force that shapes choices across various contexts. The evolutionary origins of our sensitivity to scarcity provide important context for understanding its power. Throughout human history, resources critical for survival, food, water, shelter, mating opportunities, were often limited. Individuals who developed heightened attention to scarcity and acted quickly to secure limited resources gained survival advantages. This evolutionary history has left us with a neurological architecture that responds powerfully to perceived scarcity, often bypassing rational analysis in favor of quick acquisition. Neuroimaging studies have revealed the specific brain mechanisms involved when we encounter scarcity. When people perceive limited availability, the brain's insular cortex and amygdala, regions associated with anticipated loss and negative emotions, show increased activation. Simultaneously, the nucleus accumbens, central to our reward system, demonstrates heightened activity, creating a potent combination of fear of missing out and anticipated pleasure from obtaining the scarce item. The practical implementation of scarcity takes several distinct forms, each leveraging slightly different psychological mechanisms. Quantity-based scarcity, only 5 remaining, emphasizes limited supply, creating direct competition with others. Time-based scarcity, offer ends tomorrow, leverages our aversion to losing opportunities permanently. As we transition to exploring time constraints, we'll see how this specific application of scarcity principles focuses on temporal limitations to prompt faster decisions. Time constraints represent a specialized application of scarcity principles focused specifically on temporal limitations. This psychological technique leverages our complex relationship with time to create motivation and prompt action. Research in behavioral economics and decision psychology has demonstrated that properly implemented deadlines can significantly increase response rates, accelerate decision-making, and overcome procrastination tendencies that might otherwise prevent action. The psychological foundation of time constraints involves several interconnected mechanisms. First, deadlines create what psychologists call procedural utility, the satisfaction derived from completing tasks and eliminating open loops. Our brains experience a small dopamine reward when we check items off our mental to-do lists, and deadlines help trigger this reward system. Second, time constraints activate loss aversion specifically related to opportunities. We experience stronger motivation to avoid losing an opportunity forever than to gain an equivalent new opportunity. The effectiveness of time constraints follows specific patterns related to time frame and presentation. Research indicates an optimal window for most decisions. Too short, minutes or hours, creates reactance and perceived manipulation. Too long, months, fails to generate urgency. For most consumer decisions, studies show that 24 to 48-hour deadlines create optimal urgency without triggering skepticism. For more complex decisions, 7 to 10-day windows typically balance thoughtful consideration with sufficient motivation. Strategic framing significantly impacts deadline effectiveness. Research demonstrates that emphasizing what will be lost when the deadline passes, this offer expires Friday, creates stronger motivation than simply stating the deadline exists, offer valid until Friday. As we explore the contrast principle next, we'll see how presenting options in relation to each other creates powerful perceptual shifts that influence decision-making beyond the value of individual choices themselves. The contrast principle represents one of the most fundamental yet frequently overlooked aspects of human perception and judgment. This principle, extensively documented across cognitive psychology, demonstrates that we don't evaluate items in isolation, but rather in contrast to other available references. Our perceptions of size, value, difficulty, attractiveness, and numerous other qualities are dramatically influenced by what we've recently experienced or what's simultaneously presented for comparison. The neurological basis for contrast effects provides important insight into their power and inevitability. Our brains evolved to detect differences rather than absolute values, a survival advantage that helped our ancestors identify changes in their environment that might represent opportunities or threats. Neuroimaging studies reveal that when we make comparative judgments, the brain's lateral intraparietal area shows distinct patterns of activity that directly encode relative rather than absolute values. In practical application, the contrast principle explains why the order and context of options dramatically impact perception. A product priced at $50 appears expensive when presented after $30 options, but seems like a bargain when shown after $100 alternatives. The same principle applies beyond price. A moderately challenging task feels easy after a difficult one, but demanding after a simple one. These contrast effects operate largely automatically, influencing judgment even when we're consciously aware of the comparison manipulation. The strategic implementation of contrast takes various forms depending on your objective. If you want something to appear more reasonable or attractive, present it after an option that creates favorable contrast. As we transition to examining the decoy effect, we'll see a specialized application of contrast principles specifically designed to guide choice among multiple options through strategic alternative presentation. The decoy effect, also known as the asymmetric dominance effect in behavioral economics, represents one of the most counterintuitive yet powerful influences on consumer choice. This principle demonstrates that adding a strategically designed third option to a choice set, one that is clearly inferior to one existing option but not the other, can significantly shift preference between the original options. In essence, the decoy option serves not to be chosen itself, but to make one of the original options appear more attractive by comparison. The psychological mechanism behind this effect stems from our cognitive preference for easy comparisons and clear relative advantages. When faced with complex decisions between options with different strengths, our brains seek simplifying comparisons. The decoy creates what decision theorists call an easily evaluable dimension, a clear, direct comparison where one option dominates another. Once this dominance relationship is established, it creates a positive halo around the dominating option that influences its comparison with other alternatives. The classic demonstration of this effect comes from Dan Ariely's research on subscription options. When The Economist offered two options, an online-only subscription for $59 or a Print Plus online subscription for $125, most people chose the cheaper online-only option. However, when a third decoy option was added, print only for $125, the same price as Print Plus online, preference shifted dramatically toward the Print Plus online option, which now appeared to offer exceptional value compared to the clearly inferior print-only decoy. The implementation of effective decoys follows specific patterns. The most powerful decoys are those that are asymmetrically dominated, clearly inferior to one option, the target you want to promote, but not necessarily to others. Research shows that decoys are most effective when they are similar to the target option, but clearly worse on at least one important dimension. This creates a dominance relationship that is easy for the brain to process and extends positive associations to the dominating option, demonstrating how strategic choice architecture can predictably influence decisions without changing the actual value of the original options themselves. The Pygmalion effect demonstrates that people tend to rise or fall to the level of expectations placed upon them. First documented by Rosenthal and Jacobson in 1968, their research showed that when teachers were told certain randomly selected students would show remarkable progress, those students actually demonstrated significantly greater improvement than peers, despite being chosen at random. This effect operates through interconnected pathways. Positive expectations activate reward anticipation brain regions, releasing dopamine that enhances motivation and cognitive performance. Simultaneously, increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and self-regulation, primes the brain for success. Effective implementation requires expectations that are perceived as authentic rather than manipulative, specific to the individual, focused on effort rather than innate ability, and ambitious yet plausible. These characteristics create challenge stress, productive psychological tension that enhances performance without triggering anxiety. As we examine reframing failure next, we'll see how these positive expectations can be maintained even when inevitable setbacks occur. Reframing failure transforms how we interpret and respond to setbacks by shifting perspective on negative outcomes, viewing them not as terminal judgments of ability, but as valuable feedback and opportunities for growth. This approach converts failure from a devastating endpoint into a productive inflection point in development. The psychological foundation lies in attribution theory. Carol Dweck's research identified two distinct patterns. Fixed mindsets attribute failures to permanent limitations. I fail because I lack talent. While growth mindsets attribute them to temporary factors. I fail because my approach needs refinement. These different attributions create dramatically different emotional and behavioral responses from identical outcomes. Effective reframing follows a three-part structure: acknowledging the actual outcome without minimization, identifying specific, changeable factors rather than global, permanent ones, and articulating actionable insights for improvement. Research identifies several beneficial reframing approaches, including the learning opportunity frame for knowledge acquisition and the process improvement frame for skill development. As we explore perspective taking next, we'll see how understanding others' viewpoints complements these reframing capabilities. Perspective taking involves understanding situations from viewpoints other than our own, a foundational capacity underlying effective social functioning, ethical reasoning, and problem solving. This cognitive skill involves actively imagining another's perceptions and constraints without necessarily sharing their emotional state. Neurologically, perspective taking activates the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex and temporoparietal junction, which manage the complex task of suppressing our viewpoint while constructing alternative perceptual models. This neurological profile explains why perspective taking requires deliberate effort and deteriorates under cognitive load or emotional stress. Practical implementation follows a three-stage process. Explicitly acknowledge your current perspective, systematically identify relevant stakeholders or alternative viewpoints, and explore each perspective considering their distinct information, priorities, and concerns. This process counteracts egocentric bias, our unconscious assumption that others share our perceptions. Research shows that arguments constructed after deliberate perspective taking are rated approximately 20 to 25% more convincing than those developed without this practice. As we examine loss aversion next, we'll see how understanding universal cognitive tendencies provides crucial insight into decision-making patterns. Loss aversion, first identified by Kahneman and Tversky, establishes that the psychological impact of losing something is typically 1.5 to 2.5 times stronger than the positive impact of gaining the equivalent. This asymmetry fundamentally shapes human decision-making, often leading to choices that maximize security rather than opportunity. Evolutionary origins explain its pervasiveness. Historically, losses often carried more severe consequences than equivalent gains provided benefits. This survival-critical asymmetry shaped neurological architecture that prioritizes loss prevention, creating a deeply ingrained bias persisting even in contexts where such asymmetric consequences rarely apply. Practical application involves strategically framing choices to highlight potential losses rather than equivalent gains. Research demonstrates that messages emphasizing what might be lost generate approximately 50 to 70% more response than identical messages highlighting gains. This effect appears particularly strong in health communications, financial decisions, and environmental conservation, areas where immediate action might prevent future losses. This principle connects directly to FOMO, fear of missing out, by highlighting limited opportunities, exclusive access, or diminishing availability to create decision urgency. The Benjamin Franklin effect demonstrates that asking someone to do you a small favor often creates stronger positive feelings than if you had done something for them. Named after Franklin's approach to winning over a political rival by borrowing a rare book. This seemingly paradoxical effect has been extensively validated through psychological research. The mechanism centers on cognitive dissonance, psychological tension between helpful actions and negative feelings toward the recipient. To resolve this discomfort, the mind unconsciously adjusts attitudes to align with behavior. I helped this person, therefore I must like them. This automatic reconciliation creates genuine positive feelings that wouldn't develop through passive interaction. Effective implementation requires favor requests that are small enough to be easily fulfilled, within the person's expertise or interest, legitimate rather than manipulative, and occurring early in relationships when attitudes remain flexible. Research shows that starting with very small requests that gradually increase creates the strongest relationship development. As we explore the IKEA effect next, we'll see how involvement in creation processes creates a complementary form of psychological investment that further strengthens connection. The IKEA effect reveals that people assign significantly higher value to products they partially created themselves, regardless of objective quality. Named after the Swedish furniture company famous for self-assembly products, this principle demonstrates that effort invested in creation substantially increases attachment and perceived value. This effect operates through several pathways. Self-creation satisfies our fundamental need for competence, the sense we can successfully impact our environment. Creation involves extended self-incorporation. We see creations as extensions of ourselves. And effort justification, we unconsciously inflate the value of outcomes requiring significant effort to avoid cognitive dissonance. Practical applications extend beyond furniture assembly. Research shows involving people in partial creation of products, experiences, or solutions substantially increases satisfaction, commitment, and willingness to pay premium prices. Even minor customization opportunities significantly enhance perceived value and emotional attachment. Organizational applications demonstrate broad relevance. Research indicates employees participating in developing policies show 5.5 times higher compliance than when identical guidelines are simply imposed. As we examine the endowment effect next, we'll see how ownership further enhances the value created through effort in creation. The endowment effect establishes that people assign substantially higher value to items once they take ownership, regardless of objective market value. Classic experiments show participants randomly given coffee mugs immediately valued them at approximately twice what they would pay for identical mugs they didn't own. This instant value inflation through mere ownership has profound implications for influence strategies. The psychological foundation operates through several mechanisms. Loss aversion. Once we own something, giving it up registers as a painful psychological loss. Attachment theory. We form emotional connections to possessions beyond their utilitarian value, and extended self-incorporation. Possessions become part of our identity, making separation feel like a small loss of self. Strategic applications include free trials that create temporary ownership, triggering attachment. Research shows consumers are 3 to 5 times more likely to purchase products after trials compared to viewing identical products without trial access. Home on approval programs similarly capitalize on rapid psychological ownership, developing once items interpersonal space. Beyond physical products, the effect extends to psychological ownership of ideas and decisions. Research shows people value their own ideas approximately 40 to 50% more highly than identical ideas attributed to others. Strategic vulnerability, the deliberate disclosure of appropriate imperfections or limitations, represents a counterintuitive yet powerful approach to building authentic connection. Research demonstrates that controlled vulnerability often strengthens rather than weakens trust and rapport, while paradoxically enhancing perceived credibility. This effect operates through several processes. The pratfall effect shows minor mistakes increase likability for otherwise competent individuals. Vulnerability triggers reciprocity norms. When someone shares something authentic involving social risk, it creates subtle pressure for similar openness. And appropriate vulnerability signals honesty and authenticity. increasingly valued qualities in an era of often superficial communication. Empirical research shows impressive results. Leaders acknowledging mistakes are rated approximately 23% higher on trustworthiness and 15% higher on leadership effectiveness compared to those maintaining flawless facades. Negotiators strategically disclosing appropriate limitations achieve approximately 20% better outcomes than those using traditional power positioning tactics. Effective vulnerable disclosures involve genuine but minor limitations rather than fundamental flaws, include solution orientation rather than mere confession, remain contextually relevant, and ideally humanize while simultaneously highlighting complementary strengths. The psychological influence techniques explored in this guide represent powerful tools for understanding and ethically shaping human behavior. These evidence-based approaches provide extraordinary insight into human decision-making and interpersonal dynamics, while raising important ethical considerations about their application. Ethical application requires continuous reflection on three fundamental questions. Does your influence create genuine value for the other person? Does your approach respect cognitive autonomy? Would the person feel appropriately influenced rather than manipulated if they understood the psychological mechanisms involved? These questions distinguish between ethical influence respecting human dignity and manipulative tactics exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. The most effective application involves thoughtful integration rather than isolated techniques. Research shows psychological methods work most powerfully when applied as complementary systems. For example, combining the Pygmalion effect with reframing approaches creates a comprehensive developmental environment that both motivates performance and builds resilience. The scientific foundation of these methods distinguishes them from pseudoscientific dark psychology tactics. The approaches we've discussed are grounded in decades of rigorous research, replicated across diverse contexts, and subjected to continuous refinement through scientific testing. This empirical basis allows for ethical application grounded in genuine understanding rather than manipulative exploitation of misunderstood concepts.